Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 6th episode of the Taksim Middle Eastern podcast. Today I'm in Detroit, Michigan at the home of Hachig Kazarian, renowned clarinet player who has left an indelible mark on Armenian Kef music. With countless recordings and performances, Hachig helped redefine this genre of music. Hachig, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So Hachig, to get started, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into playing music?
Certainly. I started very young, and I actually started playing Armenian music. I did not know how to read music, and I learned by ear. And once a week, my dad would take me to this Varbed's house, and his name was Zurnaji Haig. In the old country, he played the Zurna, and when he moved to America, for whatever reasons, never played the Zurna, switched over to clarinet. But he must have been in his 70s when I went to him for lessons. I'd go once a week, and he would sing the songs for me, didn't play the clarinet any longer. And I would have to learn the song while I was there, and when I got home, I'd have to practice it, otherwise I would forget it. So I'd be coming home, and at 10 o'clock at night, I'm practicing the clarinet. But that's basically how I learned. And one of the things that sticks with me as an important factor, that all of the songs that we play that are like the specialty dances, they all had words. And unfortunately, I was too young to even realize that those songs should have been recorded. But he would sing the songs, and all of the songs had words. And in some ways, I would have to try to remember a word here or there in order for me to try to remember what the melody was, because obviously I couldn't read music at the time, and I didn't have a recorder. So that's how I really learned. And I played for maybe 2 years before I took any lessons.
So when you say specialty dances, songs like Sepobad, Lazbad.
Yes, all of the village dances. In Detroit, we had a lot of the Hayranaksagan Miyutunes, the compatriotic societies. We had the Vanetsi organization. We had 2 or 3 of the Kuretsis. We had a Sepastasi organization, and numerous, Avrek Fenese, they had one. And when they had their parties and their affairs, we would have to know what their music was, and we would have to play those songs. So when I was a young man, this Haig, that's what he was teaching me. So, if you play for the Sepastasis, this is what you have to play, and these are their 3 songs or whatever. Those are the specialty songs that I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's like Music 101, play to your crowd. Right?
Yes, absolutely. And another thing that happens now that I'm thinking of those specialty dances, the people dancing, if you went from, let's say, a 9/8 rhythm, and while you're still in that 9/8, change the song, they knew the music so well, the dance step changed. Unlike what goes on today, if you play a 9, they all do either the old-fashioned tamzara step or they do the new one where there's 2 rows facing each other, and this is all they know. And in many instances, if you play a song, let's say that's in a major key or something, they may even think just because it's a major key and they did a tamzara, and let's say you played a Greek song, a kalamatiano, they would try to do the same step. The kids today, in the most part, the young folks, do not understand the music, don't know the rhythms at all. Mm-hmm. So to get back to what I'm saying, we would play 3 different Erzengatsi 9s, and as you switch from one to the second one and the third one, immediately the person who led the line would hand signal, would let everybody know, and they would change the dance step.
Yeah, and that's akin to how I feel like music is going today. Everything's just blending together
exactly
into one step, whereas before it was a little more nuanced in terms of both, what the musicians played and what the crowds knew and reacted to.
Well, music beyond that, all music, all Middle Eastern music almost sounds the same anymore. It truly does. They use the keyboard. They use the durbaki. They use whatever sounds they can, the electric guitar sounds and the synthesized sounds. So it's really getting to be the same.
Yeah, it's like a melting pot.
Absolutely. And it's probably because they're looking for new material. And it's easier to take a song that you already heard and you know what feelings or what nuances are there and just change the text into your own language, and it becomes whatever your nationality is.
Mm-hmm. Going back a bit, so you started taking lessons from Zurnaji Haig, but what was that spark that drove you to music?
My family was musical. They did not play an instrument. My dad would sing and dance, and his father, I actually had a grandfather. Many of them I'm first generation, but many of the people my age didn't have a grandfather. I was fortunate to have a grandfather. And his father sent him to America so that he wouldn't be drafted or taken into the Turkish army. Because in those days, they would take you in, you'd be in the front lines, and you would be the first one that would be killed. And if the enemy didn't, they would shoot you from behind. But his dad sent him to America. But he was a teenager. He had already known all the various dances. And from the stories that I remember, he used to even do Kurdish dances with the Kurds. So he was very musical. And he would occasionally pick up a drum and with sticks make the sound of a davul. So he knew, and there would be young boys, people that were 12, 15 years older than myself, that would come to our home all the time, and my grandfather would teach him how to do these dances. So that was the spark. And my grandfather would sing constantly, and I grew up with that around the house.
I'm sure those turned into house parties and people over.
Exactly. People would come over, either young folks to learn dances from my grandfather, or other men his age would all come, and they'd all sit down in chairs, not quite as a circle, but around the room, and they'd all take turns singing. So I grew up with that.
And then once you started taking those lessons, I'm sure you started sitting in and playing with them in the house.
Then I started playing. And this Zurnaji Haig told my brother, you know what, you're bringing him for his lessons. You should start learning to play drums. So my brother got a drum set, and we started off, he would play a drum set. Then later on...
Like a regular
trap set. A regular trap set. And then later, he was able to get a hold of a dimbag from out east someplace and switched over to dimbag. But we must have played 3 or 4 times, jobs, with just 2 pieces. And then immediately we scrounged up a saxophone player, an oud player, and another drummer, and we had a band going. But my foundation was set on all those village songs. And to continue in that vein, Haig was teaching me strictly Armenian. And he was an interesting fellow himself. He played Zurna, as I said, but when he came to this country, he was in Lowell, Mass for a length of time. And there was a band that played in the city, like a marching band. It was an old Italian band, and they approached him knowing that he knew something about music. They actually said, we'll buy you a clarinet, and taught him how to play, and he played in this band. That photo's on my wall. But the interesting thing is he didn't play a C clarinet Albert system. He played on a BAM system. Even the guys in the old country now are playing on an Albert system or Ehler system, which is not the BAM, which is the new system. And that's what I'm playing. So this man was way before his time. But he told me after a year and a half, he says, I've taught you whatever I can teach you. I'm going to take you to this gentleman's house, and he's going to teach you how to play Turkish music. That never materialized. It would have been a great thing for me. We actually went to the house. An interesting thing is the wife intervened and is telling him, what business have you got dealing with this little kid? Really. So Haig, we got up, he said, let's go. So that ended that story. So I never was able to. I actually didn't learn how to play Turkish music until many years later when I went to New York.
After Haig, how did you then develop? Just through the school system, or?
Through the school system. I took a few lessons, and the band director said, you should think of taking private lessons. By this time, I'm in middle school, and I got so involved and was so excited that I would take a bus myself and go all the way downtown Detroit to take clarinet lessons with an old Italian teacher who was a clarinetist with the symphony, and he taught at University of Michigan. So once I started building up my technique, then that's when I started learning to play Greek or other forms of music. And I was able to, the fact that I knew the instrument, I was able to listen to something and then figure it out on my horn. It was not as though I had to labor over it for hours.
Yeah, and how did you transition into performing in front of people as you were picking this up?
Well, at first it was out of necessity. There were no young people like myself that played, and I was much younger than any of the musicians that I ever worked with. And there were a couple groups in town that had all old men that played, and obviously maybe they were looking for a young person to play. But it was right about the time when Artie Barsamian and the Vosbigins were recording in maybe the early 50s. At that point that I was still playing, and God, in the 50s, I think I was only 9. However, once you get the bug as a musician yourself, you get motivated and you just search and search as much as you can. And this is where Greektown comes into play here. There was a store in Greektown called Delmar, and it sold recording, phonograph, record players, records, food, Greek food, and whatnot. They even had some appliances, but that was the main store if you wanted to buy any records.
A one-stop shop.
One-stop shop. So when I went, of course, at that time, there were Armenian clarinetists, but they really didn't play very well. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they learned to play in the old country or if they just, out of necessity, picked up an instrument. But many of them did not sound like a clarinet. They played the clarinet, but the tone was different. For whatever it's worth, now that I'm being trained, I'm listening to that and I'm saying, I don't like what I hear. And at that point, I started buying Greek records. So I started off modeling myself over the Greek clarinet sound.
Because that was more prevalent.
That was very prevalent. And not only was it prevalent, there were records coming out all the time, constantly. So as I'm growing up, I started going to Greektown because we had a Greektown that had 2 nightclubs.
What were the names of the clubs?
One was the Kozani Bar, and the other one was the Lafayette Bar. The street is still there, but the club's buildings have been torn down. I was fortunate enough at the Lafayette Bar to see Achilles Polos, who was on these records from 1904, the Columbia, the large, and he was an old man at the time, but I saw him there.
What was the scene like in those clubs?
The scene was basically old men. Basically old men. There were
just a lot of them.
A lot of old men. Many of them lived in that area, as we called them growing up, bekar martik, single men, and bekar is a Turkish word for it. But they would come, they would have their beer or their rye whiskey or whatever it was and throw money, and the musicians basically played for tips. And if you didn't throw tips, they stopped playing. It's not as though...
Not very subtle, yeah.
No, it's not like you go to a nightclub now, the band doesn't take a break unless the DJ takes over or something. There is no downtime. No, you didn't throw money. They would just sit there, hold their instruments, and smoke their cigarette or whatever. But Jimmy Nazaretian is the name I was trying to think of, and he worked the circuit. He would play in Boston. He would play in New York. He'd come to Detroit. He would go to L.A., and these guys actually had a circuit that they would work on.
Touring around
To these nightclubs. And this is one of the reasons why we young Armenians have played Arabic or Greek or Turkish or whatever. We are looking for this music. We can't get enough of it. And we don't have a country. And I've said this numerous times. They kicked us out. The genocide forced us out. So we did not have music. We didn't have records being made. So any music that we received was from Turkey or from Greece. And what happened is musicians like Marco Melkon, when they recorded, they would record all their songs in Turkish. I don't know why they never recorded in Armenian, but later in life, I've discovered that Marco Melkon, recording for Balkan and a few of the other labels, he recorded some 14, if not 16 or 18, 78 records, all in Greek. And many of them were some of the same songs, but sung in Greek instead of Turkish.
Oh, just changing the words.
Changing the word. I understand. I don't know much about Marco, but I understand he came from Greece, so he sang in Greek also. But it came to me later in life, well, if you guys are recording in Turkish and you record in Greek, why didn't you do it in Armenian? I don't know why they didn't.
Yeah, maybe they didn't see it as big a market as the other
stuff.
Well,
whether it was a big market or not, I don't know, but they could have done it in Armenian, and that music would have been palatable for those individuals that don't want to hear a song in Turkish.
Yeah.
Then your song literally becomes in whatever nationality the text is in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is what you spoke about earlier, how the songs are of that region.
Yes,
so
exactly.
They take those songs in whatever language it may be.
Right.
They'll, add accompanying words or lyrics to it.
I mean, the song that we played, the Harsum Pesa song, I've heard it the same way, played in the villages in Turkey. They play the same material. It's the same thing. It's one and the same. And I'm saying that Had we lived in Turkey and we didn't have an absence of culture for 100 and some years, we'd be playing that. And they'd be playing it. If we were there, that's the music we would be playing.
So did you play in Greektown?
When we made our first album, and now this is a number of years later, I think it's now we're talking 1957 or something, we did record a Greek song on the recording. And of course, since we were in Greektown, we'd hear them enough time and they would see us, and now they knew that we were musicians. I did start sitting in and playing at Greektown, along with the musicians that I worked with locally, the high tones, and we would occasionally sit in and play with them.
Were the musicians mostly Greek?
They were all Greek. Jimmy Nazaretian in Detroit at that one club he was an Armenian. There would be a Greek clarinetist, there would be a Bulgarian santur player, and then they would bring bouzouki players, and the bouzouki players would also go on the circuit. They bring one in for a month, and then he would go someplace else. So it was in a smaller version of the New York scene with international musicians on the stage.
How did you get from Detroit playing to New York?
Practice. There's a lot that happened between that. At that point, after junior high, and again, instrumental in my life was Zurnaji Haig, said to me, Daras, he goes, son, he says, there's an Armenian band director at Tech. It's a high school of the performing arts, downtown Detroit. And he said, I hear a lot of very good things about him. And he said, there's a music store in one of my buildings that I rent that they tell me that he comes and he buys music for his ensembles and whatnot. And they say that this guy is top-notch band director. So I set my sights on going to this high school performing arts, and Dr. Harry Bejan was my band director. And at that point, everything I did would be working as hard as I could playing classical music, learning to play in the woodwind quintet, learning to play in the clarinet quintet, learning to play in the concert band, in the symphony orchestra. And it was a top-notch school. Two of the Temptations were students that went to school with me. They were my peers.
Oh, really?
That sang in the Temptation. Diana Ross was a graduate of Catskills. She came from there. But that's what happened, and my playing became a little bit more strong. The tone was strong. I think I developed my Armenian style at that point.
How is that transition going from the community functions, playing to the house, where what you were playing is probably more full of quarter tones and that our style of music, transitioning to that classical style?
I didn't really use quarter tones that often. And when I did, I didn't know what I was doing. I tried to imitate what I heard. This doesn't sound the same, so I have to do this with my finger, or I have to do this with my embouchure, my lip. I have to change the tonality of that note, otherwise it doesn't sound the same. So I legitimately did not know what I was doing. I did it by imitating. If you listen to a particular kind of music, you will pick it up. It's almost like saying that, you have a memory.
Muscle memory, yeah.
There's also memory for sound. And my best example is if you listen to a LP or a CD, listen to the sequence of the songs, the order of it, enough. When song 1 is on, if you stop it, you're going to know exactly what song 2 is. And when you sing it, you're going to sing it in that pitch. So I truly think that's what happens. You memorize these pitches. So this is what you're trying to imitate. So there are young oud players that I hear that play now. They do things without knowing what they're doing. And that's what happens. We have a lot of young, talented musicians today, and I think that they do it by remote control. They're just imitating.
Because that's what they hear, and that's what they listen to, and that's what they're playing.
It would be a wonderful thing if there was a method of learning, if there was a textbook that would teach it to you. And I always come back to this. Our music would be much more modern, the folk music that we play. We would have a larger selection. Our music would not be 8-measure songs. There would be songs with more musical content if we had a country. So we had 100 years, and I've said this before. So one of the things that we did in order to find new material, when the Soviet Armenia was thriving, every other month there was a new record that came out. We would take these songs that they performed and we would, quote unquote, jive it up, change the tempo to a 10 if it was a 6, or take a 4. And this is the only way we had new material. After a while, think about it. It gets very boring. This is my repertoire, and there's nothing else available. So there was a time between the Eremites, the Barsamians, the Gomidas band. I'm not sure about the Vospigians, but they would all make up songs. And this is the time when they said, oh, this is the Eremite special, this is the Barsamian special, or whatever.
We still play today.
We still use it today. They needed material. There was no source of material, you understand? So there was a necessity. And out of that necessity, we created that style on our own.
Yeah, or even songs like that we affectionately call Shurchbar, which
yes.
is Shalacho.
Yes.
Just played in a 10.
Exactly. And Shurchbar meaning Shurch, the circle. It's nothing
circle
more
dance.
than Galorbar or Shurchbar, another word for it. But it was out of necessity. And I truly think that our music would today be very similar to what you may hear that's going on in the interior of Turkey today. And that's all Kurdish at this point. Our music would be very similar to that.
So how did you end up from Castech to Juilliard?
My goal was not to be a village clarinetist. My goal was to play in the symphony. Interesting thing was I was a junior in high school, and the New York Philharmonic came to Detroit to play, and it was the first year that Stanley Drucker, which after 50 years finally retired from the New York Philharmonic. But he must have gone through 8 conductors. He was probably the most seniority of any member of that orchestra to this day, including this present time. And he is still alive. But that was my goal. But going to Juilliard, of course, you need to live. There were no dorms. I had an apartment. My parents, they didn't have deep pockets. Mm-hmm. Of course, I started playing jobs. Mm-hmm. And that's when I found that most of the New York area had the nightclubs, and most of the Armenian musicians all played Turkish, or they tried to play it, or their effort was to play Turkish music.
Yeah, we just recently interviewed John Barbarian. He called it like a United Nations of
yes,
musicians.
Absolutely. And I think that was part of their philosophy. 8th Avenue had, I would say, 12 nightclubs. 29th through 27th Street.
Do you remember the names of some of the clubs?
Oh, yes, sure. Egyptian Gardens, which was upstairs, and I forget exactly what the street number was, but it was right on the corner. And Louis Matalon, who was a Sephardic Jew, he played the oud and sang, and he's on some of the old Balkan recordings. The violinist was the violinist that played with Marco on all of Marco's records. There would be a Greek bouzouki player. There may be a Turkish singer, a Greek singer. I mean, all of the clubs were strictly international.
And everybody's communicating the best they can, whether it's broken English or just probably
the funny thing is
the common denominator.
The common denominator was Turkish, because the Greeks were Anatolian. And or if they were from not Anatolia and they were from Izmir or the large cities, they spoke Turkish. So that was the connection. The Armenians knew Turkish. If there was a Turk, the Turk knows that. So it was truly the common denominator. So that was the one nightclub. You went across the street on the corner, I believe it was called the Arabian Nights. And there was an oud player there, Joe Badoué, was Arabic. At the time, Tasos Chalkas was playing clarinet there. John Papas, who was a clarinetist, later in life, he had all his teeth pulled. So he had played violin. He didn't play clarinet any longer.
Out of necessity.
Out of necessity. His brother played the santur. So at that one club was Chalkas on the clarinet. John Papas's brother played the santur. There was a Greek bouzouki player, and there was Joe Badoué playing the oud. Next door, it was Istanbul, and at one time I can remember that Safet Günyar was a clarinetist. Ludi Herat played oud there. Ahmed Yatman played one of the first virtuosos on the canon. I mean, he was absolutely awesome. He played there. And Lutfi Güneri was the singer at that club. Back to the corner, if you went in one block, it was the Port Said. And I can't remember who worked there, but Chick would work there occasionally. But that was one of the first places that drew Americans. Leonard Bernstein and other musicians and actors would leave their play, the stage play, and they'd come, we're going to Greektown. It was a trip for them, and they would flaunt the fact that Leonard Bernstein would frequent the place.
Who are some other names that pass through there?
The Britannia, and I would always go to the Britannia. I just liked their variety of music, and that's where Marco Melkon played. And when we'd go, we would throw money. Marco would tell us, "Voch dalak traminedek." He would tell us. I mean, and all the story. Don't throw your money. And I would always hear he's money hungry. This guy does anything for a buck. But he loved seeing the young guys there, and he would sometimes tell us, "If you play the dumbag, come and play dumbag with us," or whatever, you know.
Yeah, just to sit in.
And he was a powerful oud player. He would compete against any bouzouki player. He would never be drowned out. He would never, ever falter, and he knew Greek, so he fit in very well with them. But that was one of the places. There was one of my favorite spots to go to. I believe it was called the Kifisya, and that's where I first saw Halianis, Panayotis Halianis. I think he just passed away. He was one of my favorite. He played such a sweet clarinet. It was just absolutely awesome. But that club, I don't know how they existed, being the fact that it was like 2 blocks from everything else. It seemed like they didn't have the crowd there all the time. But that was a club. Also, Costa Sevastaki, who was really my idol when I was 15, played there. And he also played, I was very surprised, a BAM System C clarinet. Everybody else played either a C, but they were all Albert System clarinet. Ludi Herat would be there on occasion. And there would be times where us young guys would go to the club and we'd be there until closing, which was like 3 o'clock. And Herat would need a ride home. And Darak, he's in his voice, you know. And then before he even did that, he'd give you his money. And he'd say, "Count this." He says, "There should be X, would be tips." He'd say, "Oh, there's $90 there or something." And he'd say, "Okay, he knows that's 90. He says, "Give me all the singles." He always wore a vest. So he would put the denominations of his money in the different pockets so that he knew exactly what he was doing. So if he wanted to give you $9, he knew exactly how to give you $9. Just paper money, there's no way he's going to see. He was totally blind. But he would put the different denominations in his different pockets.
What was he like?
He was a card, very serious, very, very serious. He seemed sort of timid, and I'm assuming that's because he was blind. But once he started playing, you couldn't detect anything timid about his playing. Very sure of himself, extremely sure of himself. But I've seen him change strings on his oud on the stage and tie them and loop them and do it within 10 minutes or less, which is almost unbelievable.
I couldn't do it.
You know, and another interesting thing is he smoked cigars, and he always cut the cigar in half. It would be too long, the ash would drop or whatever, and he knew he couldn't finish it. But he's always smoking a stub. It would be half of a cigar when he smoked.
Yeah, that way you could probably manage it.
He was very helpful, though. He would tell you, and there are recordings that exist today where you can hear him speaking, and he would say in his voice, "Dawak kides, asiga hijaze." You know, he would say, "I'm playing in Hijaz." And then while he's playing, he would say, "Now I'm going Raste." Obviously, I wouldn't have known him, and I was too young. But when I saw him later in his life, it seems like he wanted to be very helpful. And at age 13, which I left out of the story, Ludi Herat was in town. And he would visit different cities and not necessarily work in the nightclub. The people that were his fans, the people that were Turkish-speaking Armenians that loved this music, they'd throw parties. And like during the weekend, he may play 3 parties, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, do nothing during the week. He would stay in L.A. maybe for weeks at a time, months at a time. And this is how he earned money. He would literally go to a factory that made fishing line, and he'd buy the huge spools of 50 yards or whatever it is. And if his wife was with him in their apartment, they'd measure it and cut it. They'd measure it and cut it. And he'd wrap them individually, and he'd take them back to Turkey and sell them because they still had gut at the time, I'm assuming. So he would buy fishing line, which is not 100% perfectly straight. You know, I guess if you look at it under a microscope, it had variations to it. But he would sell it. He says, "They love this in Turkey." He says, "They don't have strings like this." On top of taking the fishing line, he would have to pay a deposit on the huge reel. Then he'd take the reel back to get his deposit back. But the story I neglected...
It's like bottles in Detroit.
Yeah, what I neglected to say, and this was my little claim to fame when I was a little chubby boy, Herat, at age 13, wanted to take me to the Catskills for the whole summer. He says, I'll teach you everything. My parents wouldn't let me go. And I remember that day, why won't you? I mean, I cried and put a fit like a teenager does. Why not? Why not? Why not? But, I've been to the Catskills, and I know that they play heavy music.
There's that song, obviously, Catskills Jump On, but what did the Catskills mean music-wise?
Oh, what it was is all the Armenians would go away. They leave the city to go to a cool, because it's in the mountains, literally, and there are trees, and they don't live in trees. It's all cement. It's concrete city, right? So when they went to the Catskills, their children would be able to play under the trees. They'd have a lake to swim in. They'd have a pool or a pond or something. So they would go in it. It would actually be recreational for them, and it'd be a way to get away from the heat from the city. So they hired musicians. And in many cases, they would hire people, of course, the serving staff or a chef to cook Armenian food. So there were Armenian hotels there. And that's how some of the younger musicians in the New York area would start. Marco played there, Chick played there, Herat would play there, literally to the point where on Sunday morning, Ludi Herat and another person who knew Badarak would have a short service on Sunday morning.
Get out.
Honest.
That's unbelievable.
I actually have a recording someplace on a cassette of them saying, we're at the Waverly Hotel and I'm with Sargavak so-and-so. It was somebody from Turkey, but Armenian, and Ludi Herat, and they gave a short morning service.
This is how little I know. We've heard about the Catskills and we play this song all the time, but this was a big organized event.
Yes. So the old timers would all go, and it'd be, think about it. They live in apartments. They don't dwell in homes. They're apartment dwellers. In those days, some of the buildings didn't have an elevator, and it's hot. They didn't have air conditioning. So it's the first thing they want to do in the warm months. They're running away. And where are they going? They're going up to the mountains where it's 20 degrees cooler. And they're living in a hotel. They're eating Armenian food. They're listening to our music, and they're even if it's for a weekend, I would assume that they just go on Friday and come back on Monday.
Yeah.
So that's the big thing about it. And perhaps some of the things that you heard were from maybe my generation or people that are a little bit younger than me, how wonderful it was. And when they were young. Jack Chalikan used to go there. He had an uncle that was a chef, and uncle or was a cousin, I think it was an uncle. And actually, they were the ones that owned the Dardanelles. And he was a chef, but Jack would go during the summer and he would wait tables. And that was his story on, I believe, how he started getting familiar with the music and then playing canon. But yeah, it was a big thing, the Catskills.
Speaking of Jack, what was the Kef Time scene like?
Right. That came after college for me. Quite frankly, Buddy Sarkisian called me and said, look, we're in Vegas working, and I'd like to have you come. Freddie Elias is here. Richard Hagopian is here, whatever. He first went there, I think, with 3 pieces. Freddie, a Greek guitarist, and himself. But I said, I can't. Those were the days that we had the draft system. So I had a student deferment. Otherwise, if I wasn't in college, that I would have been drafted. So I said, I'm sorry, I can't. I have to finish school. But had I done that, I would have been drafted. So that came after I graduated. And when I graduated, the only jobs that were available to me were junior college jobs, and I didn't want to do that. And by that time, I had thought, I don't want to wait around until there's an orchestral job that's available. I know that some of my friends in college waited around 2-3 years before they found a college gig. My last year of college, I was already married, so I needed a job. But then I called Buddy, and I said, Buddy, if you need me, I'm going to be available. And lo and behold, I had the job. We hit it off very well, Richard and myself. But we worked our contract. They finished up at the Flamingo. We went to the Bonanza, and the Bonanza opened up and closed within 4 months. So now
short contract on
short,
that one.
Really short. So now we have a new job. We opened up the Frontier Hotel. And during my stay in Vegas, when I lived there after many years, they imploded the place. So I played for the opening, and I saw the implosion of the front, the full circle of that. But when the contract at the Frontier finished, my wife was pregnant. We celebrated the birth of my first child, my daughter Lori. She was born at Sunrise Hospital in Vegas. So now we need a job. Somehow Richard put the feelers out, and we left Vegas and we went to the San Francisco area, Fresno area, and all the different towns around Fresno and Visalia, Clovis. There were Armenians that owned clubs. We would go and work 2 days here, 1, 2, 3 days in a row in a different place. We went to the Arabian Nights in Fresno and we worked that. We did everything. We played a little bit of Arabic. They had belly dancers. We played for belly dancers. Some of the younger people, I'm saying younger people, my age younger people now are coming, so they want the bars. So we played bars. There were old-timers that would come, and this is where I met Mesrop Takakcan, who was the clarinetist on the old Kevorkian records and whatnot. So I've been fortunate. Not only was I fortunate to see all of the big names in New York, I ended up going to Fresno and running into musicians there, too, that were all the old-timers on the records that I listened to when I was growing up. So I had that opportunity. But that worked, and no sooner than we pulled that group together, Jack got involved, and we worked the AYF Olympics. That was, I believe, in San Francisco. That started it. So we made a record, Kef Time Las Vegas, Kef Time Fresno, and that was released, and that was the beginning of all the Hartford affairs.
Yeah, and those were landmark records for that style.
Definitely, definitely. So there was the recording of Las Vegas, Fresno, Hartford, Detroit, and again, out of necessity. There weren't too many records being made at this time. Mm-hmm. It had slowed down a little bit. So the young kids now are buying LPs, and that's how that sprang up. And then once we hooked up with Jack, so it was Jack on the cajon, Richard Wood, myself, clarinet, and Buddy. And that became the Kef Time group.
So Hachig, in terms of your approach to playing clarinet in this Kef and Armenian genre, you have a very signature sound that has stayed the test of time. You had a major impact on the sound of the clarinet and how clarinet was used in this type of music. How did you develop this?
Obviously, it did develop over time. It's related to my classical training. It's related to the sound that I like to hear a clarinet play in. And it relates to all the music that I've listened to. My style is collective of all the different genres and the things that I like that they do. And one of those things is the cleanliness of trying to play neat and clean. I've found that when people play and they try to copy somebody, they exaggerate. So one of the things that I've always thought of is don't copy somebody. Don't copy a taksim. Use it as a model and do your own version of it. And I think listening to old-time clarinet players, and I'm talking about clarinet playing lead, and listening to old-time Greek clarinet players, again, playing lead today, they don't play lead. Very rarely do they. Bouzouki's lead, and they use them for a solo, or if they do, the lead is still the singer. But I tried to incorporate that, a sort of a rhythmic style. And one of the things I used to do, even as a young man, when the oud player would play, I would watch the mizrab hand. And I realized that if we're playing and we're not in rhythm and something is off, it's not just the drummer, it could be the mizrab of the oud player, because that mizrab basically does what the drummer is playing. So that impressed me, that idea. And what I do a lot of times is with the finger and tonguing the note, I try to mimic the mizrab. So if I'm playing a rhythm like a 10, I try to do that. And that's what probably gives me that particular style. But the other factor is that I really don't copy. If I would be as honest as I could, I would seem to think there are no more than maybe 2 or 3 measures that I've copied from a solo that I know where it's from, and I copied it and I use it, and it's part of my signature. But I just try to create, and if I'm playing a song, I want to embellish that song, because most of our songs really are pretty simple. They're really not difficult. It doesn't require technique. It's more of the feeling that you want to project, of course. But so as I play this material, I'm saying I need to have something that keeps me interested. So I embellish, and I embellish the way it is, and that's something that has been on my mind all the time, and that's how I think of a tune. And as I said before, the other factor is, rhythmically speaking, I immediately think of the oud player's mizrab hand. And if I'm working a job and I want to make sure that we are together, I'm watching the oud player's right hand. Because you can be listening to the sound or whatever it is. By the time you hear it, you may be a little late. So as soon as I think that there's a problem rhythmically, the first thing I do is I make sure that I'm with that right hand, or I give a look like, hey, we're not together. But I have no method other than what I stated of my particular style. And the fact that I haven't truly changed that much, it has not varied. And I'm thrilled that I'm still able to play, and in that same fashion.
Hachig, do you have any advice to give to aspiring Middle Eastern musicians or musicians in general?
Any advice that I would give would be, first, listen to as much music as you possibly can. Listen to different styles of the same genre. Listen to different genres of music. Middle Eastern music, listen to Arabic, listen to Turkish, listen to Armenian. You're bound to find a style that you're going to want to play, but be true to your style. Don't imitate, because when you imitate, you're just a cheaper copy of whatever you're imitating. That's the first thing. And I find that when musicians do copy, they always exaggerate. Whatever it is that they hear that they're trying to incorporate in their playing, they exaggerate. And that in itself takes away from their style of music. And it's like if you're trying to sound smoother, now it almost sounds whiny. If you're trying to play quarter tones and you're emphasizing that, before you know it, it's like that quarter tone is not very tasteful. It's not as subtle. It's not. Yeah, be very subtle about what you're doing. Know what you're playing. Know the notes. One of the important things is to learn your instrument. In my opinion, if you know a song, you can learn it without playing your instrument. And your fingers will automatically know where they have to go. So you have to learn your instrument. So when you hear a certain riff, let's say, and you want to incorporate it, you could very well do it. If an oud player or a bouzouki player or whatever, another clarinetist does something, and if you're on that same stage, if you hear it, and if you like that particular sound, your fingers will, if you know your instrument well enough, will know exactly where they're supposed to go. And practice slow, because technique doesn't mean much. You'll find that young players try to impress you with technique, and they say nothing musically. And you'll find that most of the meaningful music is not fast music. It's always slower music. But practice slow at first so that you can go fast later on. And again, that's learning your instrument. And try to play as clean as you possibly can. And if you can learn a little bit of theory, knowing 16th notes, how many to a beat, quarter tones are one thing, but playing eighth notes, playing quarter note triplets, the different aspects, it opens up your vocabulary verbally so that you can communicate with another musician, and it opens up your musical vocabulary so that you can play it. And it helps you in learning new material, because you find that once you gain experience, you've played in various keys, you've played different registers of your instrument, and you've accumulated a certain repertoire. Before you know it, you're able to hear a song 4 or 5 times, and you'll play it. And that, again, is now you're familiar with the mode, let's say, and you're familiar with your instrument enough that your fingers will automatically go where it's at. But everything that you do shouldn't be random. You should plan it, definitely plan it. And if you're working with other musicians, it's a group. You do not play alone. You speak to each other. What are we going to play? Let's make sure it's in tune. If we're out of tune, you stop and you tune it. You don't keep going. If there's poor balance, stop and correct the balance. Because when you play with a poor sound, that tears everybody's sound down. If you play with a distorted sound on your instrument because it's cranked up too loud on the amp, you're destroying it for everybody. It's not just for you. And I seem to think that maybe it's sort of corny, but they say there's no I in band. And it's true.
Yeah, you're a unit together.
You have to be a unit. You have to be a unit. You have to play rhythmically together. You have to play in tune, pitch together. And if you work with somebody long enough, before you know it, you're going to think of changing the song. You may even change it at that moment. Or you're going to be inspired and you're going to give the same feel to a particular song. So it is important that you play as a group, think as a group, and work together. You cannot work on a stage with 4 musicians or 5 musicians and be an individual. If you think you're going to be the star, forget it. It's being counterproductive.
Well, with that, Hachig, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. I mean, I know I've learned a lot through our discussion. I hope the folks listening have. And again, thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you, and I hope your audience appreciates our little conversation here.
Thank you again for listening to the podcast. You can check us online at taqs.im or search for us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Until next time.